we could feel the impact strongly. But this isn't the first time the US has imposed tariffs. How will US tariffs affect the Singapore property market? Let's dive in. In this video, I'll break down how tariffs affect trade, sentiments, inflation, and how they might ultimately ripple into the property market. Tariffs are basically taxes on imported goods. So when the US imposes tariffs on things like Chinese electric vehicles, steel, or semiconductors, it makes it more expensive for businesses to bring those goods into the US. Why? Because they now have to include these added costs into the production. But here's the thing. The global economy isn't just about US consumers buying imported goods. Supply chains have become global. Parts made in one country, shipped to another, assembled elsewhere, and finally sold in yet another country. So if any part of that supply chain passes into the US, it gets hit with the tariff. And when costs go up, businesses react. They either raise prices or cut down on production volumes because it has gotten more expensive. This sets off a ripple effect across the world and global trade slows down. Even though Singapore is not the main target of these tariffs, we could feel the impact strongly. Why? Because trade makes up a huge component of our economy. When global trade slows, it affects our GDP, our companies, and eventually our property market too. But this isn't the first time the US has imposed tariffs. In fact, tariffs have been used throughout American history at different points, especially to protect domestic industries and manufacturing. One of the more recent examples was in the first Trump administration. Back then, the US imposed sweeping tariffs on Chinese goods as part of a broader US-China trade war. And we saw some very real consequences from that. This time around, the Trump administration has gone even harder on tariffs, imposing rates of up to 145% on certain Chinese goods. In response, China has hit back with tariffs of up to 125% on certain US goods. On top of that, the administration has also introduced a baseline 10% tariffs on imports from most countries. But here's the twist. As of now, those tariffs have been paused for most countries except China. So the market right now is in a bit of a limbo. Businesses are unsure whether these tariffs will be rolled out fully, adjusted, or scrapped altogether. And that uncertainty, that lack of clear policy direction, is making companies, investors, and even consumers more cautious. When trade policy feels unpredictable, it is hard for businesses to plan ahead. And that can create ripple effects across the global economy, including here in Singapore. Let's break down how US tariffs could impact different parts of the economy, and ultimately how all of this could ripple into the property market. So first, how could global inflation be affected? Well, in today's world, supply chains are incredibly complex. Tariffs don't just affect the US consumer buying imported goods, but they can actually help to push prices up across the globe. Here's why. Take the automobile industry for example. The US might be assembling pistons, which form a part of the automobile engine. They might manufacture some parts locally, then ship them to factories in Mexico or Canada for further assembly, and finally import the finished product back into the US. Now, if any part of that supply chain crosses into the US, the tariffs will kick in. This increases production costs. Pistons made in the US would then be more expensive when it is exported back to Canada or Mexico, where the whole car is assembled. This means that the final price of the car, despite being assembled in Mexico or Canada, will still go up in price. So unless the US controls the entire supply chain domestically, it will be difficult to avoid this added cost. Now, even if production stays in the US, it still doesn't mean cheaper goods. In fact, it often means higher prices because the cost of doing business in the US, things like rent, labor, and materials, is generally higher. So either way, whether you're importing or making the product entirely in the US, the final product becomes more expensive. Multiply that across different industries, and what you get is higher global prices, which could continue to drive inflation. So how much is trade expected to be affected? The World Trade Organization originally expected global trade in goods to grow by 2.7% in 2025. But now, they have slashed that forecast and are predicting a contraction of 0.2%. That's a pretty sharp turnaround. And it's not just the World Trade Organization sounding the alarm. The United Nations Trade and Development Body also released a report expecting global growth to slow down to just 2.3% in 2025, citing rising trade tensions and growing uncertainty. Now, just to give some context, economists generally consider 2.5% growth to be the threshold for a global recession. So this 2.3% projection That's a signal that the world could be heading towards recession territory. Back home in Singapore, the Ministry of Trade and Industry has also revised our own growth forecast. Instead of growing between 1 to 3%, our GDP is now expected to come in between 0 to 2% in 2025. It's not negative, but it does show that our government is already pricing in a weaker economic outlook, largely due to the uncertainty caused by the US tariffs. So if global growth slows, the next big question is what will happen to interest rates? Well, a lot of that depends on how the US economy performs. If we start to see signs of slowdown there, for example, higher unemployment or sluggish economic growth, the US Federal Reserve might be forced to cut interest rates so as to stimulate the economy. And when that happens, interest rates back here in Singapore often follow suit. This means that mortgages could get cheaper for both homeowners as well as potential buyers. Because trade makes up a massive component of our economy, roughly 3 times the size of our GDP, it is almost certain that Singapore will feel the effects of any global slowdown in trade. Right now, the government's official GDP forecast is between 0 to 2%, which, to be clear, still doesn't signal a recession. But that balance is delicate. Any further deterioration in US-China ties could easily tip the scale. The good news? The government has already taken steps to prepare for this. A high-level task force has been formed to assess the potential impact and prepare contingency plans. It is led by Deputy Prime Minister Gan Kim Yong and includes 5 ministers, a clear sign that they're taking the situation seriously. Now here's why that matters. As long as the government can maintain business confidence and keep unemployment low, there's little reason to expect a wave of homeowners being forced to sell their properties. And since interest rates are likely to come down if global growth slows, this will make mortgages more affordable and reduce the financial pressure on homeowners. What about construction costs? How could they be affected? A lot of our construction materials come from diverse sources, so we are not too reliant on any one country. But construction costs could still be affected by changes in global supply and demand. For example, US tariffs might push some demand for construction materials from the US towards domestic producers. One material that could be affected is steel, as the US is one of the largest importers of Chinese steel. So depending on how the global supply of steel plays out, we could see some fluctuations in steel prices. On the flip side, if local construction projects require complex parts from the US, like transformers, chillers, or cooling towers, we might see the prices of these goods rise. This is because US companies will likely be competing with local projects for a limited supply of these components. So while the full impact of construction costs is still unclear, what we do know is that construction costs generally trends upwards. Unless there's a major economic slowdown, it's more likely that we will see prices increase in the construction sector. So after all of this, what does it mean to the residential property market here in Singapore? Singapore's economy is expected to slow down, but it is still projected to grow this year. Even if interest rates fall due to a contraction in the US economy, it will make mortgages more affordable, which means that we are unlikely going to see a wave of fire sales anytime soon. On the flip side, home buyers might see their loan eligibility increase if interest rates drop. However, people's willingness to take on more debt will depend on how secure that they feel in their jobs, especially since we know that the global economic environment will become weaker. Now, when it comes to the new launch market, increasing construction costs will likely put pressure on developers to hold prices. That being said, much of it will also depend on the level of new supply in the different regions. I would expect prices to be most competitive in the core central region, mainly because there's a higher supply there relative to the rest of central region and the outside central region. I don't anticipate any price cuts from developers, especially since they have 5 years to sell out before the ABSD penalty kicks in. However, we could see more attractive starting prices in the core central region, since developers will want to sell a certain percentage during the launch weekend. This is great news if you are a buyer with a good ballot number. Ultimately, as long as the government can maintain business confidence and keep people employed, I believe the property market will remain resilient. We might not see a sharp correction in prices, but they could grow at a slower pace, especially with slower GDP growth and more supply coming in at the top end. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give me a like and subscribe so that I know to produce more content like this. If you'd like to see more of my videos, you should see a pop-up right now in the middle of your screen. Take care and see you in the next one.